Hello, and welcome to Contemplations. I'm joined by Thomas.
Hello.
And I am Josh. And what we are going to be talking about today is philosophical idealism. And you might be asking, what on earth is that? And I think you'd probably be in good company unless you studied philosophy in not knowing what this was. So, philosophical idealism is something that asserts that reality, or at least some philosophical idealists assert that reality is indistinguishable from human perception. And I know that you have an objection to the word perception.
Yeah, only for the simple reason that most idealist philosophies are based on the idea that reality is inseparable from mind. And one philosopher, which I know we're going to talk about later on, does make the claim that reality collapses entirely into perception, but most others see idealism as much more wide-reaching than that.
Sure. And the reason I've actually chosen perception is because in my field of psychology, obviously your field is philosophy, we try and be a bit more specific with what aspect of mind something is. So if I were to say, it's in the mind, I wouldn't necessarily be the best psychologist because, of course, everything is supposedly in the mind, all thoughts are. So there's kind of a bit more of a push towards using language specific to which areas, and of course through using perception you're invoking certain brain areas, the visual cortex, places like that, where through using that word it also connotates other kind of physical areas of the brain and other things.
It applies to a specific form of intentionality in our experience, if you like.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean.
Well, if you perceive something, there is an acknowledgement that you've perceived it, and it's recognised as a perception. So there's some intention in there, if you get me. Whereas you could experience something that you don't perceive, which again is something I know we'll discuss later on. But yeah.
So there's a little kind of caveat I'd like to kind of add into the kind of perception thing. I know that it's not necessarily the best thing, and I do agree that mind kind of is more accurate and all-encompassing in the philosophy side of things, but there is also a key kind of distinction in perception where you can have perhaps 30 different areas of the brain acting all at once, like it's a very broad system, and perhaps our interpretation of our senses can be added into that. And I think that that's what many philosophers meant by mind. It's not just the sensory information itself, it's also our interpretation of that. And some psychologists and neuroscientists may argue that those systems are very inextricably linked to the areas which process the actual information that's coming in.
Okay.
But that's not necessarily the focus of what we're talking about today. So why am I wanting to talk about philosophical idealism? So this view is common amongst people who see subjective truth as being superior to objective truth, or objective truth not really being possible. And I think that is a precondition of their belief. Do you think that's reasonable?
I think that's very reasonable. Yes, a lot of, shall we say, intersectionalist-based movements seem to proceed in their political activism and what they advocate from the idea that their sense of selfhood is sacrosanct, as in they already know what they are, and posit themselves or present themselves as this unsullied thing that must be accepted irrespective of the input that the objective world has on them.
Yeah, and, that seems pretty much how.
Yeah, so a lot of leftist movements are very much in the kind of subjectivist, working within the subjectivist tradition that you're talking about.
And
yes.
You can kind of pinpoint this when they start talking about my truth, or talking about their lived experience, because of course lived experience, this is something I actually wrote an analysis article breaking down, but it implies that there's something about their perception in particular that makes their kind of interpretation of the world somehow more valuable than someone else's, and that people don't have the capacity to understand others unless they've experienced something, which I don't necessarily believe, but I can at least kind of I can understand it in some cases where, for example, if someone gets into a serious accident, I think the experience of that happening to them, people can sympathise, they can feel empathy, they can understand why they might feel bad, but they may not know the exact feeling in which that person kind of has to put up with after the fact.
Yeah. But of course, the value judgment of I suppose you could say the LGBT lobby in general on the subject of gender pronouns is that we're just suffering more than you are. You don't know my experience, and thus you can't make a value judgment of what's falsifiable in how I wish to identify. But of course, that applies to literally everyone else, and they don't want to extend the discussion to how that would work as a universal.
Well, I think that they see their problems as particularly unique because they see their cause as like a civil rights sort of thing, don't they? And therefore it is somehow different to other suffering because it has a political element to it. And
and the cultural hegemony they have decided is rigged against them, completely irredeemable.
Exactly, yeah. And of course, they also suggest, particularly intersectional theorists, suggest that only oppressed peoples and those trained in their discipline can spot things like microaggressions and so-called implicit racism, which I don't really think is a thing. So they're implying that there's an element of perception which other people are not aware of, and I think that these claims haven't really gone they haven't really received as much attention as they might otherwise have received. Certainly other areas of this kind of theory and the wokeness in general has received a lot of attention, but these claims seem not to have been as analysed. I don't know whether you've come across anyone who has looked at it.
I haven't. I mean, Jordan Peterson has of course tried to dabble into it to a degree on a contemporary level, but I can understand why people would, or academia would, shall we say, be apprehensive in attempting to do so. It's because their findings wouldn't be particularly attractive to where the current, where opinion currently is on these subjects. So maybe that's a variable in why there isn't actually much research going into it.
And just before we actually get into the actual philosophy of it, I wanted to kind of just outline my kind of position a little bit, at the very least, at least on the woke stuff before I get into the philosophy, in that my own belief is that most people are biologically predisposed to have a capacity to empathise with other people, and therefore, as long as you're taking that seriously and you're not being negligent, you actually have good intentions to understand the other person's mindset, then I don't see there as being too much of a distinction between whether you experience something or not. Obviously, it's dependent on your ability to empathise, but as long as there is some kind of intention to understand someone, you can at least understand the thought processes involved, even if you don't necessarily have the same exact setup.
Like, even if someone's claim to being like oppressed is completely arbitrary, that's not to say that people don't sympathise with you for feeling that way, for example.
Exactly. And I do think that sometimes other people can have a better understanding of someone's thoughts and feelings than they themselves can have, because sometimes when they're caught in the midst of their own emotion, it's difficult to make heads or tails of it, whereas an outsider can look at it more coolly and rationally, with less emotions affecting their ability to think. And sometimes, I mean, this is of course the premise for having a psychologist talk to someone, like talking therapies and things like that. That's the entire rationale behind that. So obviously there is an ability to do this, otherwise these things would be useless, and I don't think they are, at least some of them aren't. I thought it'd be useful to actually go into the philosophical differences in philosophical idealism, because there is something of value to it beyond its implication in modern politics as well. I mean, there are opinions in which I think we both agree on philosophical idealism. So there are, broadly speaking, three different types. Sometimes there are other ones which are proposed. But these are the three main ones that are perhaps going to come up in discussion the most. So the first one is subjective idealism, which takes as its starting point that objects only exist to the extent that they are perceived by someone. So this would be perhaps the case of if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, it did not make a sound. I think that's a fair interpretation of what a subjective idealist might say.
More or less, yeah.
And then there is transcendental idealism, which posits that the existence of an objective consciousness which exists before and in some sense independently of human consciousness, thereby bringing about the existence of objects independently of human minds. So I think that kind of ties into a kind of a religious sense in a way, doesn't it? Because it's implying, I know that's how it was often proposed, that human perception perhaps might be tied into that of gods, for example.
I mean, you could say there's something kind of intrinsically Christian at the heart of transcendental idealism, in the idea of this being ineffable beyond that we're striving to try to comprehend, and being limited to, I suppose, the faculties that we have in order to understand it as the finite fallen beings that we are. The same can apply to subjective idealism.
Yeah, I was about to say that as well.
Yeah, and some people do refer to transcendental idealism as subjective idealism, which I don't think is helpful. But
I think it's fair to make the distinction. Right?
It is, yeah, because ultimately it's your innate categories that are producing your experience in the case of transcendental idealism, which is kind of subjectivist. But there isn't that as much weight on perception as there is in subjective idealism, in transcendental idealism. It's more of an attempt, more of a serious, sophisticated attempt to understand how objective knowledge comes about of the of the world outside of us.
So it doesn't necessarily deny entirely that things do exist outside of ourselves. It's simply that we may not really be able to know them.
Exactly.
So the final one is absolute idealism, which is strongly tied to Hegel, I believe. I don't think I'm mischaracterising that.
No, he very much is arguably the arbiter of the tradition, either him or Schelling, depending on your reading. But he is the high priest of absolute idealism, yes.
So his view is that there is an objective reality, but that this objectivity is inseparable from the mind's thought categories.
Yeah, he is completely hostile to the mind-body dualism. He sees to mind-body dualism. He sees it as a complete fallacy, in effect.
As do I. And we're going to be talking about Descartes in a minute. I am going to be tearing that apart because I find it ridiculous. Anyway, before we move on to that, though, I wanted to break down what Hegel means by the mind's thought categories. So you explained this to me quite well yesterday, and it was something that I was a little bit confused about myself.
Okay. God, I've got to trace back exactly how I provided such an exceptional explanation yesterday, because it doesn't come about very, very often. But compared to someone like Immanuel Kant, who posits these ahistorical categories as the ways in which we understand the world, Hegel says that these categories ultimately change based on the social and historical conditions that we live in. Our experience of the world adheres very much to that, and thus knowledge of the objective world in turn depends on the way that we apply our thought categories and how we reflect on them. And science as a practice to Hegel is not something that has a legitimate claim to knowing, for example, that ineffable beyond. It is a way that we can kind of know about it, and a lot of
you mean knowing in a sense of absolute certainty,
yes.
Right?
Yeah,
rather than we can kind of get a picture of the world, but we can't know what is true with absolute certainty.
Yeah,
which I think is perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, he's very, very conscious and critical of the overreach of Enlightenment philosophers in claiming that we have objective knowledge of this. Science gives us objective knowledge of the objective world, and he doesn't refute that or say that that's explicitly wrong, but that you can't separate your findings from the thought categories that you use to actually bring it about. These are indexical facts about the objective world. Then it's not knowledge of that thing in itself, it's knowledge about that thing, and it's an ongoing process to get to know that world. But to posit the something that is how would I put this? Positing an unknowable world that you kind of know the existence of is a paradox.
Yeah.
And that's the crux of his argument. I'm not sure if that was quite as good as my explanation yesterday.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.